had never happened before in Jamaica. So I was one of those who went to a regular high school and had the privilege of, being in the classes, interacting with my sighted peers. Although by that time they were a little younger than I was, but at least I got that opportunity. And I managed by typing the work for the teachers on a regular standard typewriter, which I could use. I could type, but I couldn't read it back, which was sometimes very annoying because sometimes you made mistakes and you would really love to go back over your work, but if you typed it, you have typed it. Anyway, we continued, and I did a lot of note-taking in Braille. And in those days, we had what we call the Stainsby Braille. And the Stainsby Braille was very clunky and very noisy. Well, of course, in Work for the Blind, later the Stainsby Braille gave way to the Perkins Braille. Stainsby was an English contraption. And I think most of us know the Perkins. And that was a major change. So we had a cupboard at school where we could lock our stuff in at the end of the day. And the next day we could retrieve them and do our work. So that saved us having to cart, heavy books and Braille writing equipment and so backwards and forwards to and from school. We didn't have to do that. And we went through that process and eventually graduated, and I got a scholarship to study physiotherapy in London. And so I went to the Royal National Institute for the Blind, which ran the school at that time. The school is now closed, and all blind persons who wish to study physiotherapy must go through one of the regular training processes to be certified. But in those days, the RNIB ran the program, which was a very successful program. And it took in persons from all over the world. So in my class, we had people from South Africa. We had one Nigerian and somebody from New Zealand, and I think someone from Australia, and myself as a Jamaican, and a number of English persons. Now, while I was in England, that opened up a lot of opportunity for me. So I went visiting, made new friends, went all over the country, went on a couple trips to Switzerland, as a student. There was one incident where I booked into a hotel in Switzerland, way up in the mountains, in a place called Spinas. And that little hotel catered to blind people, but there was one stipulation, that you needed to bring your own sighted guide. Now, I didn't have a sighted guide to bring at that time, but I decided that I wanted to go on the trip. So I went on the trip and went up into the mountains. And when I got there to register, the lady said to me, but where's your sighted guide? And I said, I don't have any. She said, it's going to be difficult for us, to really take you in. But fortunately for me, there was a lady nearby, a Swiss lady, and her daughter was also going to check in to stay at the hotel. And she said, I will be his guide. So right away, I met a Swiss lady who became my very good friend. And so we had an excellent time at Spinas, and she acted as guide for both of us. And that worked out to be a fascinating experience, and one which I'll never forget. Her daughter was very good at playing the piano and singing. And so in the evenings, we had a very good relationship because she loved a lot of the music that I love and enjoy. I found teachers at the Royal National Institute for the Blind, I found them to be very professional. Some of them were blind, some were not, but they were very professional and they were extremely helpful. What I had a difficulty with was the attitude of a lot of the patients who we had to treat in those hospitals. They objected to some extent when you tried to discharge them because of the workman's compensation program. They didn't feel that people from outside of Britain should come and dictate to them when they should go home and not get the benefits and all this kind of thing. And they used to use the blind students a lot to decide whether people were faking or they were really not recovering fast enough. Because some people, when they come in sight of the hospital workers, they would start limping. But when they're leaving also, they would, be more normal in their approach. And they used to use the blind students a lot at vantage points to listen out for these people as they walk out of the compound to find out if they were really walking properly or they were still faking, because they would fake when they're coming in. But when they're leaving, of course, and they felt that they were not being observed, that would change. So that is just some of the things that, I found interesting. So I don't know if you have any questions at this point, Aaron. Anything you want to ask?
Yes, of course. All of that. All of that.
Okay.
All of it is interesting.
Yes.
Let's kind of rewind a little bit. As I mentioned to you in past, I volunteered at the St. Lucia Blind Welfare Association, and
yes.
I recall and talking to you, having this conversation, although I've never been to Jamaica, and Lucians told me that Jamaica is like a totally different country from Lucia. It's way much, busier, bigger, built up, way more built up than Lucia. What really sounded vaguely familiar was when you were speaking about, how back in the 40s and early 50s, how blind people were really not expected to do much. Well, I think it's true. What you said was 100% true. I also think that today, a lot of times blind people that I've encountered do not have very high expectations in 2020.
Yeah, quite right.
And your story was true. It was, I am only 28 years old. I live with my parents, and many of my extended family are elderly. But I have, outside of my teaching work and activities like that, I have very much of it, obviously part of it is because of my blindness, but the other huge part is For personal reasons, I have to say that I live in an undisclosed location. That's a totally
Yes.
that's a whole nother episode about why I say that.
Yes.
But I live in an agricultural community, and there are not other people around me who are my age. So, in life, as I'm sure you would agree, sometimes you just have to do the best you can. So now I'm
Oh, yes.
living with my parents,
Mm.
my brother, my extremely old and sweet and very, very, very sick and retired guide dog.
Yes.
She's in the winter of her life. She's at the end of her life. And I have my teaching job all day online, and then I got into podcasting, well, because I really felt that there was kind of a void in podcasting as far as, blind people finding a podcast where they can just come up to me and just have a conversation where we're just really relaxed and just talk about whatever, just go with the flow and just have a nice conversation about some really, really fascinating things.
Yeah.
Everything you've said so far is fascinating. And the part about back to the school, and then I'll move it forward back to the school issue, where they would only have you doing, basket weaving and those types of menial, as to today, it would not be appropriate today. But I do remember that at the St. Lucia Blind Welfare Association, you go in. I'm sure it's similar to some of the buildings in Jamaica. You go in, it's kind of like one level, and then in the basement, they have basically a factory that makes mops and brooms.
That's right. That's the kind of concept.
Right. And I recalled that, and the blind people there, they showed me, they pointed it out. They said, Aaron, this is the knife we use to cut the wood, and here's how you make a mop. And then they showed me the whole line, and they box the mops and then sell the mops. And it's a fundraiser for their welfare association. It's a big business. And
Yes.
I don't know. In America, we have mops, but we call them vacuum cleaners. But
Yes.
in other parts of the world, especially when you're trying to save electricity, which is what that's about in the Caribbean, you use mops and you use more hand tools like that, more handicrafts and hand tools. Indeed. Yeah.
Well, even here, that is changing, because now you have a lot of vacuum cleaners and electrical gadgets are really plentiful now. So, but you still need your mops,
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that there was not much to offer in those early days beyond that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, but now we have people who are graduating as teachers. We have telephone operators. We have administrators. So it's a vastly different experience to what existed when I went to school.
Yeah.
No.
Definitely, without doubt. I was speaking now, listeners. I've mentioned her a lot. She's one of my podcast friends out there in the podcast world. Culturama with Diva, you know her.
I know Diva very well.
And me as well. And she was saying on my podcast, we've been on each other's shows, but it was a very long time ago, before the radio station came into it. And she was saying how, she even in Jamaica today, blind people still have a hard time getting through university and just finding the opportunities. And I think it's very sad, and I think it concerns me a lot, actually, as a successful American, because I'm concerned that society is progressing at a very rapid rate, very out of control rate, if I might add. And I find that blind people around the world simply, in my humblest opinion, some of them are just not catching up. And it's not their fault, but I'm still concerned that there's this gap that really doesn't need to be there. We have about a minute before the break. Go ahead.
One of the things we need to look at is employment opportunities. People in the university, it's easy to get into universities in Jamaica these days, I would say, once you have the qualifications.
Good.
But what becomes difficult is when you qualify to get a job later. That is where the major problem exists.
It sounds like the problem in America too. That's exactly basically how it works in America.
So if you take your problem and multiply it in Jamaica, you can understand in a smaller space how difficult it can be.
Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aaron Richmond. He's Wilbert Williams. We're really glad to have him here on Aaron's Opinion. You're listening to the Aaron's Opinion podcast on Caroline Radio, Blind Advocate Radio. As we say, we'll be right